New outlet. Oh. What? Oh. I can't go this way anymore? Nope. Oh, okay. Sorry, first day at the lake, and this is kind of throwing me off. I gotta get this straight. There you go. All right. Welcome back to I Know a Guy Bicycles. Hang out with a guy. Sorry for the little, well, layout difference, whatever. You know, YouTube does all these changes. Anyway, welcome to I Know a Guy Bicycles. Hang out with a guy. This is the workshop. Ask me anything. And the topic today is cranksets. And of course, bottom brackets that relate it to. So if you have any questions, go ahead and throw it in the chat. We're going to go over several types. The idea is just kind of get you educated on what's out there and used, what you need to look for, maybe what kind of tools you'll need, kind of taking the scary out of used bikes, one bike at a time kind of thing. So yeah, welcome back to my garage. Hi, I'm Justin the guy, and let's just dive into this. Cranksets. Yes, well, cranksets is very, 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 very important. Why? Because number one, it's one of the three major contacts to the bike. And that's where you put a lot of your energy. That's where the force of those motor legs crank and actually push the pedal forward, and the bike accelerates, hopefully in a good direction for you. Anywho, cranksets. So let's go over the basics with a crankset and where it goes. Well, we just talked about it goes onto the bike where your pedals connect to, and that's where the force of the energy goes. So looking at a crankset, they look like this off the bike, like so, and the pedal attaches to them. 9/16 is usually the thread size on most of these cranks. 1/2 is the other side, just a side note for pedals. So if you're looking at pedals, 9/16 is most likely it's become a standard in your neck of the woods, but if you get like a BMX bike or a kid's bike, sometimes will have, or an exercise bike will sometimes have that one-piece crank, which I don't have one of those. But anyway, I don't think we're going to be missing much there. But that's, the thread of the pedals, and obvious, well, keep in mind, pedals are threaded reverse on one side and the other. So when you're putting on pedals, there's going to be R for right and L for left. So that's, your right leg and left leg. So going into cranksets. Well, cranksets, we'll just work our way from the pedals to the cranksets to the chain rings to the bottom bracket. And then we'll kind of talk about the different kinds out there, in addition to what you'll need. Also, this is supposed to help if you bought a bike or a frame and you're like, what now? Kind of things like, what do I need to buy? That kind of deal. So let's just dive into this. Cranking right along. Okay, let's do a little history. Back in time. I started in 1989 at my parents' bike shop in Parker, Colorado. And what was typically known was the square tapered bottom bracket, doubles and triples. Triples were starting to come out. And the square taper crankset, if I have one, yeah I do, is your old school. Prior to this was the cotter pin system in the 70s and the 60s, which I don't think I have any. I had some cotter pins, but so what you'll see on the older bikes and up to some of the newer ones today is a squared taper, which basically is a 4-contact onto the actual crank itself. And that's kind of like what they call the cold well contact from the alloy to the high industrial steel. Basically, sometimes these spindles are alloy, so you got that cold contact. The idea is to press them on there. The fault on these is if they loosened up, they start boogering up the inside, and therefore you didn't have a solid 4 contacts or 4 sides for the contact, and eventually over time of riding it'll loosen up and pop off, even though the crank bolts are tight. We used to do some nasty little pop can shims in there to kind of get it to work for a while, but that was one of the Achilles heels of the particular square taper. Same today, so if it's not securely tight and contact on there, it will eventually loosen itself up. So this is a cartridge bonder bracket, which they came out in the later 90s, mid-90s, which is awesome. You may have old school, which I don't know if I have anything. Well, it looks similar to like this, where you'll have a spindle, and this is a newer version, an old Dura-Ace with ball bearings, and then you can adjust it. So that's really the old school. So the tools for that is you're going to have to get some eccentric tools, older ones, to be able to adjust that bonder bracket with a hook design, that kind of thing. We're not going to go into showing you how to do all those, but just kind of be aware of those particular tools. And all bonder brackets have specific bonder bracket tools too. So add to even the level of intricacy of it. So if you're in a situation where it's like, okay, I got a frame and I want to get this crank set, and also, a side note, cranksets are specific to type of bonder bracket. So start with the crankset, and then you'll have to research and see what bonder bracket goes with it, what model and what kind. Ooh, that's a dirty one. And then you'll have to measure the bonder bracket shell where this fits in. If it's a road bike, most likely it's a 68. Some of the mountain bikes are 72, so keep that in mind, and they'll be stamped on there on most of the bonder brackets. Or if you're buying this new, or even if you're buying it used, try to get the pair together. The reason being is you don't want to like buy one and then be searching for another and see if we can get it to match. Keep in mind sometimes if it's really old or unique or weird, which we'll go into that in a second here. There are not that many options. You might find yourself in a pigeonhole of having a crankset that you can't put on the bike, which is far and few between, but once in a while that does happen. But you definitely want to get the crank and order the bonder bracket to match, measure the bonder bracket shell, which is, I can't grab a frame real quick, but it's where the crank bottom bracket goes into, and it's the width of the shell. 68 or 72 is probably the two to choose from. So going with cranksets, and then you'll need a tool to put on there. Back to my note about tools. There's a lot of different tools with different ones. If you're going to be working on bikes pretty avidly yourself, you can invest in those tools. If not, it might behoove you just to take it to your local shop and pay the 15 to 25 bucks or whatever it is to have that bonder bracket and crankset put on, because you don't have to buy the $100 worth of tools to install it, that kind of thing. You can find less expensive brands out there of tools, which are just copies of like the Park tools or what have you, or the Pedros, or the feedback tools that are really good out there. But yeah, if you're only using once or twice, and if it works, who cares, you know, on the cost. It's just going to sit there in your tool bin, and whenever you need it again, that's fine. But if you're going to be working on it pretty avidly, I'd recommend getting more of a brand name. I know it's an investment up front, but those tools last a long time, and they have a lot of guarantees to them. So if they do fail at a period of time, those companies will back it up, that kind of thing. Anyway, back to the cranksets. Woo! So cranksets, you have a double or triple. Now we have singles, going back to the singles, which is kind of crazy. We'll talk about history on that a little bit in a second. If you're doing an older vintage repair and you're looking for a triple crankset, keep in mind the bonder bracket is going to be related to the spindle length or the cup set compared to the triple. So you're going to have to do those research, the matchy kind of thing. So this has the cartridge system. This one has the through portion here, which is external bearing, or they also have pressed in bearing, which is another design, which is kind of like this here. You can see how that's been corroded. These are all done cranksets that I have just floating in a bin, so they're nothing really for sale or anything. But just to show you that external bearing, which looks like these guys, will slide, thread in independently on both sides, and then the crankset goes through, which would be this way on the bike. But you can see where I'm going with this. And these are also threaded. One's reverse, so keep in mind on that. It's not always right, tight, left, loose. So same thing with the bonder bracket shell threads and the pedals again. I don't want to emphasize that enough, because if you cross thread your pedal and you're in a horrible hurt because sometimes they have to be retapped. Also, they do have chasing tools for the bottom bracket shell for the frame. Those are expensive, so I would suggest going into the shop and pay the 15-20 bucks, whatever it is, to have it chased if you need to be cleaned up for the threads, because those tools, the good ones, and those are ones that I would really suggest you only go with the good ones was from like Park for chasing tools, the reason being, or the old Campanoli set that might be out there. You don't want to booger that up. Because if you booger up the bottom bracket shell threads where these attach to, you pretty much toast your frame. So you want to make sure you want to have that done correctly, and doing it yourself is kind of like as one of those things you just take it in and have it chased. So talking about the bottom brackets, and this particular type is external bearings. So what I'm getting at there is it's very complicated. There's a lot out there over the years, and you're talking about the last 20 years. You got 3 or 4 different styles, and then you have then you go into the different types. This is kind of like the ISIS style. No, actually, take that back. This is just the through with this is the Bontrager, but Truvea is a brand that kind of white labeled a lot of different brands out there, so they're made in the same place, but they have the same type of bottom bracket, so you want to double check on those. So that's the through one. First, to start with the square taper back in history, right? And we'll just go on to the next, which is your ISIS, or not ISIS, but spline. And which that is instead of the square taper, they actually went to like these little notches, which gives you a better contact, which holds up really well. Also, they went with the Holotech. We'll talk about Holotech here in a minute here about what happened just recently. But this is old school Holotech. I remember when these came out, it was kind of cool. It's like they had these cranks and the bottom brackets mounted into a block on the floor, and you can step on them, and you can kind of feel the flex of the old one versus this new one with the contact. So it's kind of a cool little example from Shimano Dog and Pony show they had back in the 90s. Yeah, they're like, oh, let's go up and just talk about our new stuff, which was kind of cool, which I miss those old school tech ones. So this is where revolutionary changed the cycle industry, is these contacts, which, the square taper, lighten up the cranks, the bottom brackets are all cartridges, so there's none of this readjusting and so forth. And these things, when they finally went toast, you throw it away and get a new one. Yeah, there's something to say about being able to rebuild the older ones and that kind of thing. These are not, they're a cartridge kind of thing. But as a inventory manager or a guy that's buying all these parts for the service center of your bike shop, it is a lot easier to keep it all, some in stock, easy to connect them. They hold up well. They made the bikes work really well, and there was a lot of upgrades happening in early 2000s to this style system too. Yeah, so you got the more simplicity, less tools to use, and less adjustment and less room for error, right? So that's what we got going on that. So anyway, so we went that direction, and after we went through the then they started copying them. I don't know if I have it. Excuse me, started getting over my cold. Is the ISIS version, and it was from Truveta. And what they did they had a deeper cut into theirs. And so this would not work on that crank arm. So that's where it lies. You want to make sure you match the crank to the bottom bracket, because they're kind of one and the same. A lot of the cranks are sold with their own bottom brackets. So on new, that's pretty good too. And remember, there's numbers on here for the width and also the length of the spindle. So, that's another thing to be said. Like on a, this one's a 68 shell, a 109 is the length. This would be for a double. The 118 is for the triple. So you got to kind of get educated on those numbers. If you're buying new, you can resource the company that you're buying it from and say, hey, does this bottom bracket go with this, or I'm getting this crankset woes go with this bottom bracket? And bottom bracket's relatively inexpensive compared to the cranks. Cranks can go up to sky's the limit on the price. Good morning, vaping snowman. So yeah, it's just one of those things where they've had several iterations, and then you had the ISIS, and you had a different ISIS one, which is a skinnier one. So that threw me for a loop once because I had to go look for a bottom bracket for the more narrow tapered one, which I don't think I have. But it's one of those deals like, then even when you go into another off-brand, you had a different style. Which these are the same, but this is, it'll be marked True Vade on this one. This one's still pretty good, that's why I still have it. This one's a takeoff, which is, it's look and wear, and it doesn't feel smooth. And when you're looking at bottom brackets too, they're not gonna be like spinny fast. If they're good, they're gonna be super smooth, but you feel like there's gonna be like a slick stick to it when you're spinning them, that kind of thing. That's what you want to look for. And once they're all installed, you want them to be tight, so there's no like any knocking, that kind of thing. Here comes the really sore spot with a lot of mechanics that have been around, is when somebody comes in with their bike and they're like, yeah, I have this creaking noise when I'm pedaling. And you're like, oh, this is horrible. Because we know that creaking noise could be pretty much anything, from the frame rubbing up against this, the bottom bracket can cause some creaking if it's not prepped with grease or tie prep or something like that. The contact points from here to the crank could be a problem as well. In addition to, I've had one that just the chainring bolts weren't tight, and that was causing that little creaking noise, or the pedal itself, a titanium spindle to alloy, was making a creaking noise. So you have all these different things, and as a mechanic, you're like, okay, let's start with the easiest ones first. Tighten up the crank bolts. Okay, still creaking. Then you start tearing into it. It's one of those things that could be a 5-minute fix to an hour or two, and then it turns out that's like, oh, it's actually my seat that's creaking, or the handlebars are creaking, but it's resonating down the carbon frame, and it sounds like it's coming from the bottom bracket. So the creak noise is, yeah. I've had several of those, like, oh, you're a creak. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is going to be a forever situation. All right, so now we've gone through and I want to go back in time again, and this way really cracks me up, and I'm surprised I have one of these. This is just so funny. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm sure you've seen out there, if you're watching any magazines and videos and stuff, and you see this, for mountain bikes specifically, this oval thing, oval chain ring, and I think black is really pushing it. The ones that do is the black wax, and I saw one of these a couple years ago when it first came out, and it was on a mountain bike, and I was like, what the hell is this? And so the oval chain ring is certainly not new. It's actually old. Almost 30 years old, coming up on its birthday in a few years here, about 30, hitting 30. This is the BioPace, and BioPace, if it's showing very well, it's kind of flatter here and here, and that includes all the chain rings. And this is BioPace SG. Oh, this is the aggressive one, and this was the old 200 GS. From Shimano. So they put BioPace from road to wreck to, it's like their thing. Like, oh, we got this new thing. It's called BioPace. And the BioPace, the concept was supposed to take out that dead spot of the pedal stroke. If there is a dead spot, I mean, it's kind of like one of those like, oh, there's a dead spot. It's like, I know there's a transitional piece, but that's where you, well, anyway, they made oval chain rings, and the Cranksets are fine. They're the same as in spacing and bolt pattern, but the chain rings themselves were oval. So fast forward almost 2 years later, 25 years later, they regurgitate this oval thing. And I obviously haven't seen it on road bikes because it doesn't work on road bikes. And for even recreational, it just made you feel like, those clown bikes with the wheel that kind of just woo, woo. That's what this is when you ride it. It's just like, this feels weird, that kind of thing. So they brought it back, and it probably has. I've not been so in tune with the mountain bike stuff over the years because, You know, my life is different. You know, I have a 7-year-old. I'm aged out of a lot of off-road riding, and I just don't have time. That kind of thing. Oh, yeah, okay. John here has so I have a bike that has a BB30, but want to run a Shimano crankset. Do you have recommendations of 24 adapters? Man, that is a tricky one. We was talking about the BB30s as a press fit Bono bracket, and wheels has it wheels manufacturing. There's a couple companies out there that do adapters on those, and it's been a long time since I played with one of those or converted. But I think there is, especially if you're trying to convert it to like an alloy shell version that threads in. Oh, where is it? Yeah, it's this company, Wheels Manufacturing. Something like this here. I would look up them and see and contact them and see if they have a conversion for that particular crankset. That's where it gets really tricky. You want to make sure you get the right conversion, so obviously it works right and your spacing is correct on your chain line. But yeah, I would check these guys out. This was like 3 years ago for me when I had to do a conversion. The shell on the one was damaged, and this is like a press fit shell, so they use a skinnier bearing. So there's several different ones out there, so that's why I'm like, you might want to double check and contact them directly. But Wheels Manufacturing, that's a good little side note on this. Wheels Manufacturing has been around for a long time, and it sounds kind of weird, but back in being just wheels, but they make a whole bunch of parts that are a lot of them are called problem solvers. Like it just straight up, this is what you use. Wheels Manufacturing also has a plethora of derailleur hangers for multiple brands. So that's where I go to look for those specific derailleur hangers and parts like this. So when I contact them and it says, oh, it fits this particular frame with this particular crankset, I'm like, okay, I have about 99% insurance that it's going to work, that kind of thing. And also you want to double check when you talk to them or message them. You want to see if they have recommended tools. This one had to have a press to press in, and also a different type, the tap that taps it out. This is my cheaper version press kind of thing. This is for Bono brackets, and I'll have all these different kind of fittings, so you want to make sure you get the one that fits the one you're working on. And I did get just the inexpensive one of that one, because I only did one or two of them. Just wanted to check it out too. Also, here's the bearing puller from Park. Cool little toy. Believe me, this will save you hours of time instead of using a punch. So invest in one of these if you have bearings that need to be pulled out of the crank. It's pretty kind of cool how slick that works. So yeah, that's one of those things that, yeah, the Wheels Manufacturing, they make a lot of different things for a lot of different problems. And if I remember correctly, this was a newer Canyon bike that had a creaking noise that I was trying to find in the Bono bracket, and I replaced it because the one they had in there, I believe, did not connect to both sides of the Bono bracket, because Bono bracket has both sides like this. And then you have this guy, and this is kind of like the external bearings. These work good because, you know, it's like you usually have a metal shell already in there. Well, some of the bikes with the carbon ones are it's pressed into the carbon, and there's a flex factor between both sides. Well, and what this guy is I think this might be the old one, but it's this was the older one, not the actual wheels. This is the one I replaced it with. So you see this has this sleeve and slides in there. Well, there is your creaking, right? Just a very, very small. The Wheels Manufacturing one was threaded, so you tighten that, crank it down in there, solid. So that's where the huge, where the wheels came out to be pretty good. That was the PF30. Then I have another one here, which was another press fit for the skinnier version, BB6 86 and a 92, and same Wheels Manufacturing. This is the one that was replaced. So this is not what the wheels look like, but obviously the metal one actually had threaded. This one's, so when you're press fitting, you gotta wonder, like, okay, this is nylon. I mean, how is this going to hold up very well against your monster legs, right, of cranking? So that's where the wheels manufacturing. They might be a little pricey, but you definitely get what you pay for, and that kind of thing. And they're a kind of company that have gone out there, talked to mechanics, and a lot of mechanics will submit like, can you make this to make my life better? Because I came across this issue, and they'll go and design it and do those kinds of things. So that's really kind of cool of a sub company, and they've been around for decades now. So they've been in this, they have skin in the game, and they've been, you know, that's where a lot of us have gone to, you know, those retrofitting parts. And granted, there's a lot of them out there, and some of them do work and some of them don't. So you want to kind of research those as well. Okay, where were we? Sidebar, no, that's great. Great questions. I love it. Oh yeah, back to BioPace, just to wrap that up. Going back to oval for the mountain bike, it may work. Then if you look up the new Slash, I saw this in the store the other day at Trek Slash, and they have this multiple leakage. I didn't get time to talk to the tech because they were busy with something else I was going to talk about. But yeah, it's just like this chain goes through 2 pulleys up by the crankset, and it's this massive. To me, in my head, is like, that's a lot of fail points for a mountain bike, right? I mean, like, man, I mean, simplicity is usually, I don't know. I mean, is it supposed to help you get up the hill with this big heavy machine and then ride down? I thought that's what electric assist was for. You know, I don't know. It's just one of those deals where the crank drivetrains just went haywire as well as the oval. So going into that, then you go into the, like, fast forward to today, and this is where we get to the, you know, interesting bit. I should probably backtrack to the 90s on this before I dive into it. In the 90s, there was a crankset recall, and if you've been watching any of the news, I made a couple videos about this, and it's one of those things as a mechanic in a shop, you're kind of like, oh boy, you know, it's like, sometimes it's pretty bad. Sometimes it's like not too terrible. But we're going to talk about how are we doing on time? Okay, we're doing good on time. So let's just kind of finish up the cranksets. And you know, if you're replacing one you have and you want to switch to a different brand, knowing that you need to probably most likely switch out the bottom bracket. So let's just throw that out there. So when you're looking for a new crankset, if it's a different brand, if you're going to go with the FSA versus the Shimano, or you're going to go with the SRAM crankset, or whatever brand, if you're going to swap it out to a different one, you want to get the bottom bracket that goes with that. So it is kind of, you know, they're sometimes not sold together, so you'll have to do a little research to figure out which one goes to which in the frame. Those companies, if you're buying new, you can contact them. That's kind of nice about new. Or if you buy, like, oh, that's a cool crank, I bought that crank off of eBay, and you're like, oh, well, shoot, it didn't come with a bottom bracket. What kind of bottom bracket? Then you can contact like Jensen's USA or Planet Cyclery that sell bottom brackets, and you're like, hey, I got this crank with a model number, and I'm putting on this frame, and they have all the charts in front of them because it's their products they're selling, right? They're going to have all those charts readily available for them to be able to go, oh, you need this BB or what's going to go with it, and then you ask what tools I need, and they'll be more than happy to tell you what tools you're going to need because they probably sell them, and then you'll get at least an idea. Not saying you have to buy it from them, then you at least have that knowledge, and you can go shop it and see what the best ones there, or if you want different kind of qualities. Sometimes they won't, like, oh, well, we have this bottom bracket that'll fit, but Chris King is another brand out there for high-end stuff. They may have, you might be willing crazy, you want to do Chris King and pay for that. It's just you can really go crazy with the upgrade. What the benefits is like, well, yeah, it's your third contact besides your butt and your hands on a bike, right? So it's pretty important, and that's where a lot of that lateral force back and forth is going when you're cranking down, and the more rigidity or stiffness of that direct energy going to your chain is the point to have that fast acceleration. So if you have less flex, that's where the Halotech came out back in the 90s to what it is today. which is just the newer version here. So it's like you want to get as light as possible. And these were tanks. I mean, that's where like a lot of companies are like, oh, we can lighten this up, you know. So this is where you can take a lot of weight off your bike, and it's kind of that rotational weight kind of factor. So the lighter it is, and even though you're like, yeah, it looks fancy and shiny, but this thing is a brick. I mean, it's like, okay, that's, you know, the cart. It's not hollow, it's solid aluminum. I mean, you can make about 1,000 pop cans out of that. So yeah, so you got these iterations and over the years, and you're talking about, that's one of the major focus that has been for, it still is. It's one of those things that's going to constantly changing. So there's a lot of different parts, and you got chain rings and chain ring spacings and all that. Keeping track, if you have like a 10-speed drivetrain, get 10-speed chain rings and make sure they match the crankset that you have. And to cranksets themselves, they'll have different spacing here as well for the chain rings. So if it's not compatible, you know, like this old school one, definitely will not take a 12-speed chain ring. Not would you ever want to put one on there, but it's kind of like, you gotta think matchy, right? I mean, you know, then they have like those off brands, or, you know, like, oh, this cool spider looking crank and a chain ring. Well, if you have a 10-speed, you know, 10-speed crank, you want to make sure, you know, you get the, you know, the 10-speed version of that chain ring on there. So yes, there's a plethora of rabbit holes you can go into and down, but resource it as much as you can, get the most information. I know this is one of those things like, oh man, but a couple quick questions and getting the right part and the right tool will save you hours of frustration. Let's just put it that way if you're working on it yourself. Some of those things you may just want to take to the shop, like, can you put this on for me, please? And, you know, if you just have the frame and the bottom bracket and the crankset there, like, sure, you know, it takes them like 10 minutes at best to throw it on there, and then you got the right tools and the right torques and all that good stuff. So, you know, it's like there's a lot of different things, and that's where I just, you know, an hour is not going to cover it all. I'm just giving you, at least give you the knowledge of what you need to do next and what to look for, and the right questions. That's the thing. It's like, if you have the right questions, you get the right answers, and it saves you hours of being in the garage trying to, you know, figure. And I've had problems with that too. It's like, I get something that's working, it's like, this is not right. You know, this doesn't connect. Any either message to one of the companies, you're like, oh, I need this part, or I need this tool. And, you know, it's like some of these tools, they get really wacky. I mean, you know, you have like a bottom bracket tool here, and this is Shimano, and this plastic sleeve is actually for their skinnier version bottom brackets, which are these guys. Or actually, that's the bigger one. And, you know, it's like, you can go down real quick. This is the old school ones. Oh, the real old ones for bottom brackets, like these hook deals. They used to adjust the bottom bracket. Yeah, I have a few of those. Yeah, I'm not buying new on those. The newer iterations are like these guys here from Park, and also this is from Wheels Manufacturing. They, like I talked before, they had on the tool. I needed this one to put on their the replacement for that Canyon, I believe it was, that kind of deal. Also, Feedback has like a bottom bracket one. I think it fits this guy. The external cup shell, yeah, on that guy. So, yeah, there's also a million tools to go with this too, and the process of that. So, when we'll talk about the latter part here, if anybody doesn't have any other questions at this part, but I want to talk about recalls. The dirty word, recall. Oh, you hear it on your car and you ignore those notices. You get one from the bike and you're like, huh, that's weird. You know, they've been around, they have happened quite a bit here and there. Some are major, some are really minor. So we're going to take the scary out of it a little bit, okay? Scary out of used, all right? So let's go back in time in the 90s. There was this recall on 3 different cranks, I believe, maybe 4, and it was more of the mid-range. And there were the Shimano like C10s, C15s. They looked very similar to this. They're skinny through here, and you can visually just like see them. And the recall happened on bikes that were already produced. So we had bikes on the floor for sale, new, had the affected crank arms. This was pretty massive, and this is the one I'm bringing up this because this was massive, and it was one of those situations that it did affect mid-range, which that was the higher amount of units out there. In addition to, it hit the hybrids, the mountain bike, recreational mountain bikes, the entry level, whatevers. And I don't think it did the road, but it had like which road wasn't that popular back then, so it wasn't as many cranks. So it hit us pretty hard. And what it was is something was failing on the casting, and I only saw a couple of the actual failures. So they sent out is when the recall, and it was a full recall, not just a volunteer recall. This is a full recall. If you see one, replace it. And it's one of those things where they'd send us like a box of 15 or 20 of them that we'd have like underneath our shelf. I'm like, oh, got another one. Oh, getting low. Order another 20 from Shimano. And they constantly kind of replenished us for a good couple years. And we got like a $20 credit for each one we swapped out. And it was just the crank itself. So fast forwarding to today, it was a bit, I mean, I probably did several hundred in the first month of that recall, and several hundreds for years after. And this is where I'm getting at is up to even a couple years ago, I was working in a shop in Michigan, Wheels in Motion. I still did a couple then. And the funny thing, or the weird thing is they don't have the cranks anymore. So when you call Shimano up for that 20 plus year, 97, almost 30 year recall, they're like, crap, because they know they need to take care of it. So what they do is they send a new crank, bottom bracket, and front derailleur. So it's like, they don't want to do it because they got to send all these parts. But they still do it, and they still do it today. And that's what I'm going to lead into this new one. This is a volunteer recall, which I still need to look up the definition of what volunteer means. But I'm going to put some of these cranks out of the way if anybody has any other old school questions. But, tech regurgitates from oval to round to oval again. That was another funny thing about the BioPace. Then they came with the BioPace 2, which was less oval. And then they went back like, hey, we got a new one. It's called round. Well, they added some ramping to it. And that's where you see a lot of chain rings that have different levels to them. That's not a good example. Maybe back on this guy. So for the 90s, I'd have people get all bent out of shape about a brand new bike and the teeth are worn down. Like, well, they were designed to be that way. They're like flat on certain areas and they have ramping on the inside. That chain up and down, so you got that. So, history. Okay, maybe I'll get these bottom brackets out of the way, or at least on the floor. Thanks for hanging with me today on a beautiful Saturday. Hopefully it's nice in your neck of the woods. So, going to our new current recall that was sent out. I can take my gloves off now, so hopefully I won't be getting into anything dirty. Yeah, and this time around, it's not your mid-range stuff. It's your Dura-Ace and Ultegra 11-speed. And you see that recall and you're like, kind of pucker up a little like, ooh, like I did. I'm like, oh, wait, I have 11-speed sitting in my shop that I need to be working on. And okay, let's get into this. Okay, so there's a recall. Let me pull up the website. You can Google Shimano recall 11-speed, and you'll get like a link instantly to the recall. Okay, so these cranks were produced for about 70 years, and that's been a couple years ago, so we're about like 10 years back total, right? So if you do the math. So these affect mostly non-new bikes that are coming off the production line. They're mostly, it's 11-speed, everything gone to 12. So you got to wonder if that was part of it or not. And it's also, which was very painful, the Dura-Ace and Ultegra. That's your two top-of-the-line Shimano cranksets. And, you know, if you buy, you know, if you've been buying new, you may have gotten a notice because they'll have your information. If you bought a used bike, and this is the tricky bit, is like it's like 10 years plus, right? So most likely some of those earlier generations, earlier versions of that bike have been bought and sold a couple times, and the new owners probably have no clue. And if they're not in the cycling circles so tightly to know, they're going to be missed. So that's where the information needs to get out there, and the information needs to be out there in a correct manner. Because right now, what I saw in the first week of this is Chicken Little losing their head with an axe, and it's being chased by a wolf with 3 pigs with machetes. Anyway, it's just like, it's a crap show. The release on it, it's just like the media has taken pieces of this and kind of sensationalized it to like, oh, Shimano's a recall, you know, the sky's falling. Okay, and I was kind of affected by that too. Like, oh crap, it's a recall. Oh, what does it mean by voluntary? Oh, we had a voluntary recall. Okay, well, I had one. I guess fortunately because I had to get the first-hand experience of what the hell happens when you have one, and you know, it's like, okay, I got to have this at least checked out by an authorized Shimano dealer, which I'm technically not. I mean, I can be if I wanted to be, but that's just not my wheelhouse. But anyway. So like Trek stores, most of your bike shops are a Shimano dealer. And in that case, they'll have all information and they'll be able to do the inspection, all that. Oh, there, okay. So it's really an inspection security, you like to double check, and it's free. Okay, so if you have one, first, don't panic. Second, make sure you just have it sent to you, take to your local shop, that's a Shimano dealer, and have them inspect it. It's really just an inspection, really, at this point. The numbers of what they came out were, there's 740,000 of these produced within that 7-year period, the Dura-Ace and the Ultegras. And you look at the models, you know, the Dura-Ace, SC is crankset in Shimano language for part numbers, and it's dash. You got the 9000, R9100, R9100P, and then you go into the 6800, then you have the R8000. This one's the R8000, and you'll find that number right here. And then there's also a date code, which is 2 little letters, and they'll have a laundry list of date codes within that email to look up that date code. So if this one matched both, like model number and date code, like, okay, that's the affected one. So identify that, then take it down to your shop. So it'll probably take a day or two for them to get around and inspect. Inspection, it doesn't, you know, for them, you know, they'll have, if it's on the bike, you don't have to take the crankset off. They'll take care of all that. You just roll your bike in. And actually, if it's almost better to be on the bike because they can kind of see what it's doing. What's happening is, you know, on the crank itself, there's this line ridge where it's been basically bonded together, right? It's like that seam all the way around. And the seam goes inside these plate, you know, where the chainring plates go, and you kind of go up and around, up and around, up and around, right? That's where they're looking for inspection, so they have to take the chainrings off to inspect that and see if it's delaminating, basically pulling apart from that bond. So they're talking 740,000 in the States, a couple mil worldwide. So when you're looking at that part of it, they're saying 1% is expected. 1% that would make like 7,000, if that, out of that many of them. Which when you look at parts on bikes in general, and this is what I kind of thrown out there, is you pretty much have a higher percentage of failure rate on some other parts on your bike already, you know, with that number percentage-wise. That doesn't give me any insecurity, you know, like maybe feel any better, but, you know, be realistic about that. And the second thing is, yeah, it's not necessarily means that your crankset is bad. You know, like they're saying majority of them are fine. That's what they're basically saying, which is okay. And you can have the, you know, confidence of that. And here's the thing, it's a burden Because once you have 11-speed crankset, Shimano, Ultegra, or Dura-Ace that fits in that recall, volunteer recall, they really recommend it having periodically inspected. Well, there was not really anything that says how long, because that's all depends on the rider, right? You know, it's like, does it sit in the garage? Is it going to fall apart by just sitting in the garage? No. Over age, I don't know. I don't, you know, most likely not, but I don't know. But what happens is it delaminates from this part, and you will notice it when you're riding. All of a sudden you're shifting because it pushes this chain ring out of center, and it starts, you know, bang, bang, bang against your front derailleur, and then you can kind of go, oh, that doesn't look round anymore. You know, when you spin it, you know, it's supposed to look like this, not like that. So that's, you know, your version of quick analysis while you're riding. Like, okay. So it's just, you know, it doesn't sound like it's an instant fail point. It's, you know, some of them I've seen have been like related to crashes. I think the crash happened before the fail. So there's a couple of those. I'm not going to go into those, but you know, it's one of those situations where if you currently have one, if it's on a used bike new, doesn't matter. They have a serial number on them, so when you go get them checked, the serial number be put in the system with Shimano, and you know how many times they get checked. The bike shops do get credit for this, so you're not putting them out. So your local shop that you love, you're like, I'm hard to burden you this, and they're like, oh, it's fine, we get a credit every time. And you know, the boogers, like I talked to the guys lately and they're like, this is so new. We're thinking like 6 months of riding if you ride pretty avidly to have it checked again. I'm thinking on your annual tune-up, and okay, this is your upper end stuff, a Dura-Ace and Ultegra, which most of those people that have those bikes take in bikes to have them annually tuned up once a year for the season. And if your shop is on point and they know what's going on, which most of them will because this is huge, that even though you may not even need to say it, they're like, oh, okay, well, we'll check that crankset too while it's in for the tune-up, and then they'll run the numbers and run the inspection. And you know, if they're doing a drivetrain cleaning, obviously they'll be pulling this off anyway to clean it, that kind of deal. So yeah, it is technically a little bit of a burden on the consumer in the sense of having it constantly checked. Well, safety first, and you probably should have that done anyway because all the other parts on your bike probably need to be checked once in a while too, right? That's what the tune-up is, you know. Tune-up is part of functionality and also safety. It's like hand in hand. I don't know how many times I've come across something with like, oh, you have a bad tire here. Did you know that? And I'm like, oh no. And it's like, yeah, if that would have blown out, you bomb it down 40 miles per hour on a pass, on a road bike, you're going to be a crayon on the side of the road. So those, you know, safety things are all applied to that as well. So, you know, it's one of those things where safety is not just necessarily related to this crankset to be checked, it's also on your bike. So there lies the, you know, the bad news. Sorry about that. Still going over a little cold here. But yeah, you got one of those things that, yeah, it's a burden and it's a volunteer, so you're not going to have replacement cranks. So, okay, let's dive into this a little bit further. There's a lot more, right? Okay, that's for the individual that has a 11 speed and like, oh, I need to go get that checked. Okay, you go get it checked. You go get it checked, and out comes either two things. Like one, it's fine. Here's your receipt. You're good. We'll see you in 6 months or 9 months or whenever you want to come back and bring it back. Okay, cool. I feel comfortable riding it. Go ride. Everything, you know, it's like, hey, can you check everything else out while there? The bike shops are going to be using this as a partial leverage to inspect the rest of your bike while it's there, which is good for them. But also, you know, some shops are really just be mindful because those service riders, they're trained to look for everything. You ever take your car in to get an oil change? Like, we need that air filter, you know, it's the same kind of thing. And they're not, you know, it's just, that's their job. And some of it you could pass on, some of it like, yeah. And I always ask yourself, and you can ask them, it's like, is it going to be a safety factor if I don't get it fixed right now? You know, that kind of thing. And then you got to ask yourself, is it worth it or not? I'm sorry. Have you ever been to the ER and pay a bill for the ER? You're like, okay, then you got to equate that when you take your bike in to be worked on. Is it worth the extra $50 now, or some stupid ER visit because my tire blew out because I was, stubborn to not replace it? Yeah, okay, just gonna go there. Anyway, and then the other outcome is it's damaged, it's failed, it's delaminating. And here's the, this is end of September of 23 if you're watching this, and the replacement cranks are not out yet. The replacement solution at this point is, and we're talking about only 1% of 740,000, so it's not going to be very many of them. But the solution is replacing it with a 12-speed crankset, because they're no longer producing the 11 speeds. So these are history. 12-speed with a specifically modified 11-speed chainring that fits the 12-speed. Okay, so you get a new crankset out of it, but you're going to always have to get the modified 11-speed chainring to 12 to work with your 11-speed. So you see where I'm going with this? You're going to be kind of pigeonholed to like 3 different types of chain rings, and hopefully they have the size that you want as it produced, most likely. And when they do, if it's the right size and it works for you, don't worry. These usually don't wear out that often. So especially if you lube your drivetrain, and also if you do waxes, that usually saves these a little bit longer too, according to all the tech experts out there. So it's one of those things like, okay, that's going to be the mindful. That's kind of like the second burden of this. Like, okay, it failed. Now I gotta worry about always making sure I have the right chain ring to match the 12 speed for 11 speed, that kind of deal. But it's a fix. But the other problem is right now these are not going to be the 12 speed with 11 speed chain rings are not going to be available until early part of October, which is only a couple weeks away. Well, you got to know there's been a global backlog already of people submitting these, and the ones that need to be RAs that need to be fixed. It's just going to take some time. So you're going to be out of your bike for a little while. That's a bummer. So that's the current bummer, but it's going to get fixed. If you ride on like 2 years from now and it starts delaminating, you're going to get a crankset. If you ride buy a bike 10 years from now and it has this crankset and it starts delaminating, you're going to get a crankset. 20 years, crankset. 30 years, crankset. Reason being, I know this because they're still recalling the ones 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago. I mean, so there's going to be still, so once they play that in place, there's no 1-year warranty on these. It's like, if it fails, they're going to replace it, which is actually good news in a sense, because that crankset's going to take care of. But here's the tricky bummer for some individuals that may have had these failed a few years back, and they didn't, for example, somebody bought a new bike, they rode it for a year or two, didn't get into riding, or they upgraded to another bike or changed, and that bike got sold to a used person, and that person ruled the hell out of it, went nuts, and then it failed on them. Well, you got 2 things against you. First, it's not within that first year. Second, you're a second owner of that particular bike. You don't have any warranties. So you're already thinking, oh, I don't have any warranty on this, so my crank failed. Crap. Well, I just went and bought a new one, and put it on there. Either a new one of these or another brand, or you upfront the cost on it. So all those individuals have replaced the cranks that may have failed, and also was not recorded in this recall. You got to know that, because nobody, is like, oh, some shops are on point where they'll like, oh, let's call Shimano and see, That's another thing I'm going to talk about at the very end here. But on this particular one, it's like, yeah, it failed. Then you upfront the pay of the 200, 300 pieces upper and stuff, Ultegra Dura-Ace. I mean, it's not like your $50 crankset or $100 crankset. It's like your $200, $300, $400 crankset you replace, especially if you have a power meter on and that kind of thing. So if it failed, you just replaced it and you upfront the cost of the labor and the parts. well, you're out. Unless you still have your old crank floating around. And if you're like me, like if I break something like I destroyed that of my sheer awesomeness, I'm gonna put this on my wall, right? If you still have that, and you still have that crank that failed with those numbers, hey, you can still get taken to the shop and go, new one, please, and they'll take care of you. But you have to have the crank with the part number with the date code that's correct, that's failed. So, yeah, it's like one of those things like, oh, thanks for shouting out and messaging there, that's shady. Yeah, yeah, interesting. Cranks have a lot of history. It's a very, very vital part of your bike. It is a nuisance going back to this particular recall, but they're owning up to it now, which is good. So here forward, if you have like this one, this came off of a bike that somebody upgraded, a Fuji Tai. I put original Dura-Ace back on it for vintage of the 90s, and I had this kit, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna put this on this Project One that I had, which would be kind of cool. And as I was waiting for other parts to come in to be matchy-matchy, this recall came out. I'm like, oh crap. So do I feel comfortable? Yeah, it's been inspected. I feel comfortable putting it on that crankset? Yes, I do. So going forward, buying used, as long as it's inspected, or if you go get it inspected, it's okay. It should be fine. If it's making any weird noises and so forth, go get it inspected. So on Tegra, it's only the drive side with the chain rings crank arm. On Dura-Ace, it's both. Oh, that's my... I didn't see where they went either. The drive side and non-drive side, and that's that line that they're looking for. So that's both. That's what's being affected on those. So yeah, if you have an older one still floating around, haven't inspected, if it's damaged or was damaged, go ahead and replace that. And it's one of those things that it'll take a while. Change out FSA crankset with 105 yesterday. Oh, nice. Yeah, 105s are nice. FSA, they're pretty decent. Some mechanics, I don't know. There's a lot of opinions about them, but FSA has been around for a long time. They're usually been known for the lesser expensive crankset, putting on OEM bikes. They are shiny, they look good, they work. But going to the 105, you get the Holotech stuff if it's that vintage. So maybe a little bit more array of chainring options and so forth. And when you switch out that crankset, just double check your front derailleur, make sure it fits that new. If it is a different chainring sizes, you want to check that out. And hopefully, you got the right bottom bracket to go with that 105. It's mostly, I'm assuming, is it an internal cup or internal bearing, or is it a external bearing cup set? Just one of those things to check out for. But anyway, so yeah, looking at the huge Chicken Little recall of Shimano, yeah, it is troublesome. I mean, I had one here. I talked to my neighbors. They had one, so I took their bike in for them. I want to go talk to shop guys some more. The bike shop people, they're very aware of it. They're inspecting them and sending them into Shimano for acquiring those serial numbers. And once the serial number is captured, the liability is off the bike shop, it's onto Shimano. So if something does happen, that's the direction it's probably going to go for any lawsuits. So hopefully nobody out there has been hurt. There has been a couple cases recorded. Hopefully there's some cases that there were not. I mean, it's one of those things. Cycling is, at some level, it has a risk factor to it, and it's just one of those situations where hopefully the crank was not the cause of it. I mean, I've heard a couple stories where they found the cranks damaged after they crashed, but they're the ones that actually crashed, admittedly, and not the failure of the crank itself. Not like their leg went out and like, oh, I have no foot, like that kind of thing. But there's a lot of those things where it's happened before. It sounds like it's the biggest thing ever that's happened. Well, no, it's happened in the 90s and they're still taking care of it today. This is, less affected, in my opinion, of as many cranks out there. Is there a percentage of one over 740,000 correct? Most likely not. That's their guess. If I had to guess, the percentage is probably a little higher than that, but not much. Because you have all those cases that have not been reported. I mean, there's just nobody, after you buy something used, you're not going to take it in. So that leads me to the final note here on Shimano-based parts. If you have something that's Shimano on your bike and you're riding, whatever it is, your kid's bike to mountain bike to tri-bike, what have you, if something fails on it as a shifter or a brake or a crankset, here's the lesson. Take it into, even though it's used, even though it's over a year or two past the warranty date, take it in and say, hey, this failed. Is this possibly under warranty? And ask those guys to call that company. And actually, it's not just Shimano, also SRAM or Campanoli or any of those other companies. Because sometimes you'll get the mechanic or the service manager will get an answer that they were not expecting. I just saw my daughter bounce around in the window over there. What's she doing outside? Anyway, they sometimes will just take care of it. Case in point, a few years back, I had a bad SRAM front derailleur on a bike and it wasn't working right. So I called SRAM directly and like, hey, can you give me some insights on this and help me out? And they're like, oh yeah. And we talked about it. And it's like, yeah, he bought it used. So it's a second owner and the bike's like 3 years old, whatever the case may be. And lo and behold, SRAM goes, oh, we'll send you a new derailleur. Like, what? It's like, oh yeah, we'll send you a new derailleur. We'll take care of him. No worries. So they sent me a new derailleur. A couple days later, I got a brand new derailleur. Talked to the customer, like, yeah, they took care of you. Here's a new derailleur. It's just fine now. So there lies the thing that there's always these little back channels. So you got two faces of what a company can do. SRAM, they're trying to take over the Shimano market, or not take over, but compete, right? So sometimes they're going to be a little more, okay, we'll take care of you. We'll give you this, that kind of thing. And, or, they're trying to, be big about it, or they know there's an issue and they're just like, oh, you got one of those? Oh, okay. Well, I talked to my whatever the story may be. Well, we're going to send you a new part of that. And, I've had those happen too. It's like, oh, really? It's like, oh, okay, sweet. It's like, oh, you may have had a problem with this. Yeah, we had a problem, but we're not going to disclose it. But we're going to give you a new part anyway, so here you go. So the story being said and the learnings from this, and it's a reminder of, hey, if you have something that did fail out of the realm of normal wear and tear, like a casting broke or something of that nature, you may be able to go back to that original company or have your bike shop go to that original company. Usually have your bike shop is if they have the connection with like a service agreement, that kind of thing. They usually talk to you versus they'll talk to consumers, but it's a different conversation when you're a service manager versus the consumer. For me, I don't have those contracts with those companies, so I kind of try to skate between both those lines. Like, hey, I have a shop, but I'm not a, whatever. And they usually will direct me to a shop that can take care of those warranties for me, that kind of deal. One warranty was SRAM was one of their brake levers, hydraulic. I couldn't get the damn thing to bleed for anything. And I'm like, hey, what's going on? And it's like, oh, that was one of the ones that are bad. So they'll send you a new one, but the shop's going to charge you a bleed labor. So, there's that thing too. So sometimes, but this particular recall, the labor's covered by Shimano. So you don't have to worry about that. If it does need to be replaced or be inspected, it's covered. Some of those recalls or some of those replacements, you will have to be on the hook for paying for the labor to be installed or bleed the brake, like in that one case scenario. So anywho, I'm starting to lose my voice, so sorry, a little drying out here, but thanks for spending some time with me. Hopefully that gives you some insights on Cranksets is a history and what you need to look for if you're working on vintage bikes, and kind of need to be, you need to get a little educated on it to make the right decision, to get the right crank on that bike, or you're swapping out. Like on Shady's example of switching from FSA to 105, or any, those things, you got to do a little bit of homework on it. But anywho, yeah. Oh, why is my channel not blowing up? Hey, it's an algorithm. I don't know. I'm just plugging away. It'll be there. I see some of individuals have doing the same ish thing or similar, or not as well or as much. Not to toot my own horn. I'm still more of a better mechanic than I am a YouTuber. Oh, excuse me. Oh boy. But anywho, I'm here to help out those who are here to see me. And thank you for spending time with me. And if it's beautiful in your neck of the woods, go out there and go for a ride. It is fall, so no sidebar note, the deals are to be had. A little side thing on that is when we have a decline of demand, which we've had, because everything has been overbuilt and all that, and we're at the back end of the COVID here, and going in the fall when racers, novice to pros alike, are starting to think about switching out their bikes to the newer stuff, especially when new stuff's been released, like the Specialized SL8 frame. Some of those guys are gonna be like, oh, I gotta dump my stuff and get a new. This is the time of year they start listing those things. And if you're looking for a higher end bike, this is the time of year to look for that higher end used. Even just the quantity of bikes that are out coming out now has actually driven the prices down. I still see people put a price on there so ridiculously, and you just like, oh, at some point it's going to drop, or they're just not going to want to sell it, whatever. But what I have seen in the whole, in my neck of the woods, I've been seeing a lot of carbons, or a few carbons, come up around the $300 to $400 range. They still need work. They're not perfect. They still need some work, but that's a good starting point if you're in your neck of the woods and like, okay, I'm gonna buy myself a carbon bike and go have it fixed up and pay the $200-300 to have it fixed with parts, and then you're still having a full carbon bike under $1,000. Mountain bikes are the same thing, but with mountain bikes, always be leery of the suspension, because companies only go back 4 years on supplying parts on those. So suspension, mountain bikes, be very, very, very educated on those things. Just for a case in point, if you have a shock serviced, it's going to be about $150 to $200 per shock to be serviced. So put that in your mindset. Unless you know the person and they've been servicing that suspension or never ridden it, that's something you want to look into. So be very, very careful on full suspension or front suspension bikes, or any kind of suspension at all. But when it comes to like the other bikes, road bikes, hybrids, recreational, even kids bikes, the prices are driving down. So it's a great opportunity to get something without spending a lot of money. And then you can put money into it by leveraging your bike shop to, that supports them, for the labor department, which they're fine, and some parts that are sold. Or if you're a handy individual and have some tools and like working on stuff, this is a great opportunity to build up and try something new. So that leads into my topic for tomorrow, is branding. As the wheel turns, so the days are rides. I want to talk about branding, and I want to see, have a conversation of like, what makes you buy what you buy? Are you a savvy person and you look at reviews, or are you swayed by the impulse in cap sale like I am? Like my daughter's like, I want this gum. I'm like, you have to check out and go, fine, whatever. You don't even look at the price. You just go, or that bag of chips or a soda when you're walking out. When that one bottle of soda, you can actually buy a 12-pack or a 6-pack, whatever. You walk further into the store. I'm going to talk about branding and how cycling branding has been influencing, and seeing what you guys think about it, that kind of thing. There's that conversation. But thanks for spending time with me. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully this gives you some insights on cranksets and binder brackets, and hey, spread the word, blow up my channel, share it with everybody, whatever, if they like this kind of thing. I got the storytelling perspective, like this old bike. I'll have more tech tips, 10-minute tech tips coming up. That's going to be the next series, and also industry news type stuff, which is as the wheel turns, so the days of our rides. And if you like merch, like stuff like this, there's a merch store shelf right below. The proceeds or whatever I make on that to help out my mother-in-law that makes these designs. So anywho, it's all fun stuff. It's all fun. We're all into cycling. Anyway, big warm hug. You guys take care. Thank you for spending time with me. And I don't understand this vertical plane versus horizontal that they have now, but hey, I'm off for 2 weeks and that's what happens to me, right? Anyway, have a wonderful day. Thank you for spending time with me. Until next time, from the garage.